In this story, every time you hear this sound, turn the page. The Little Mermaid. Far away, in the deep, deep sea, there was a place where the water was blue and crystal clear. In the deepest part stood the palace of the Mer King. It had coral walls, tall amber windows, and a roof made of shells. The Mer King lived there with 6 lovely daughters and their grandmother. The youngest of them had sea blue eyes and delicate skin. Like all mermaids, she had no legs. Instead, she had a tail like a fish. Some of the princesses collected things that had fallen from passing ships to decorate their gardens. The youngest princess chose just to grow red flowers and a single red tree. In the middle of her garden was a statue of a young boy. Simple things pleased her, for she was a strange, quiet child. Most of all, she enjoyed hearing about the world above the sea. She would ask her grandmother again and again to tell her about men and ships and animals. She liked to hear about flowers you could smell and creatures called birds that flew through the trees.
When you are 15, you can rise to the surface of the sea and see all these things for yourself,
said her grandmother. It would be a year before her oldest sister became 15. Each sister was a year older than the next, so it would be 6 whole years before the youngest would see the world above the water. The oldest sister promised to tell them all she had seen when her turn came. Sometimes, at night, the youngest princess would look up through the clear blue water. She could see the pale glow of the stars and the moon. Sometimes, a large shadow passed overhead, and she knew this must be either a whale or a ship. She liked to imagine it was a ship, full of the strange beings who lived above the waves. She wished she could see them for herself. At last, the day came when the oldest princess could rise to the surface of the sea. All her sisters waited eagerly for her to come back. Then they listened while she told them of a town near the coast.
There were hundreds of lights,
she said,
and music and the sound of bells from tall church towers.
The youngest princess was even more impatient. The next year, the second daughter had her turn. She came back and talked about a vivid sunset with clouds of gold and red and violet. She'd seen a flock of birds fly overhead and described how beautiful they looked. The youngest daughter wished so hard for her turn to come. When the third princess became 15, she was very brave and swam up a great river. She had seen the hills and the trees and the houses and castles. She told of the sun that was hot on her face and the children that swam in the water, although they had no tails. The fourth sister did not go so far. She could only talk of the ships sailing by and the whales spouting water. Her sister, the fifth princess, saw many different things. It was winter when she rose to the surface. She talked about icebergs and storms and huge black clouds. She told of the blue flashes of lightning that zigzagged across the sea and of the great rolls of thunder that followed. After a time, the 5 sisters grew tired of their journey to the surface. They liked to stay at home in the palace. Sometimes, however, they all rose together, hand in hand, and sang in their sweet voices to the sailors on the ships. The sailors thought it was the sound of the wind and took no notice. The youngest mermaid sat in her father's palace and wished even harder for her turn to come. At long last, the great day came. Her grandmother tidied her hair and put her crown on her head. She rose up and up until her head was above the surface. The sun had just set. There was no wind, and the sea was smooth. A large ship lay still on the water, all her lamps glowing against the dark sky. Music and singing were coming from the ship. The little mermaid swam close. When a wave lifted her, she could see into the cabin. A party was going on. It was the prince's birthday, and all the men on board were enjoying themselves. The prince was a handsome young man. When he came on deck, they set off hundreds of fireworks, and the little mermaid was frightened. She dived under the water, but soon came back to the surface. She wanted to see the handsome prince again. While she waited and watched, a storm blew up. The waves grew higher and higher. The wind howled and the ship was tossed about like a toy boat. Suddenly, a great gust of wind turned the ship over. The water rushed in and broke it in pieces. The sea was full of wood and broken pieces from the ship. The little mermaid searched for the prince in the darkness. She was afraid he had drowned when the ship sank. She knew that humans could not live underwater as she could. A flash of lightning showed her where the prince was. He was almost drowned, and he was too tired to swim anymore. She took hold of him and kept his head above the waves. Ringing from it. The little mermaid swam out to sea and waited. Some of the people from the convent came out and found the prince. They were worried because they thought he was dead. Soon, the prince got better, and the people were glad. They took him into a house, and the little mermaid was sad. The prince would never know who had saved him. She was so sad that she dived below the waves and went to her father's palace. Her sisters asked her what she had seen. She only told them about his ship and a house and said no more. Often she rose to the surface and swam to the bay where she had left the prince. She hoped to see him, but he was never there. Sadly, she went back to her garden and the statue. It was like the prince, and she often put her arms around it. She was so sad that at last she had to tell one of her sisters the whole story, all about the storm, the shipwreck, and the handsome prince. One of the young mermaids knew who he was and where he lived. Together, all the princesses swam up to the palace where the prince lived. It was a very fine building with tall, clear windows and statues that looked almost real. Inside you could see beautiful rooms with silk curtains and many pictures. Now that the little mermaid knew where the prince lived, she went there often. She was very brave and swam close to the land to watch the prince. Sometimes he sailed in a small boat. Sometimes she would hear the fishermen talking about him. She was happy to think that she had saved him. When she saw all the human beings in the palace, she wished she was one of them. There were so many things they could do. She asked her sisters lots of questions, but they didn't know the answers. She had to ask her grandmother, who knew all about the world above the sea.
Do men live forever if they are not drowned?
Asked the princess.
No, they die just as we die. But their life is much shorter than ours. We live to be 300 years old. But when we die, we just become foam on the sea. Humans have souls, and when they die, their souls go to live in a wonderful country far away,
Said her grandmother.
I think I would rather be a human just for one day.
Said the little mermaid.
I would happily give up my 300 years if I could have a soul like the humans. Is there no way I can get a soul, dear grandmother?
Asked the princess, sadly.
Only if a human begins to love you.
Said her grandmother.
But that won't happen. Human beings do not like our tails. They have two things called legs, which they think are better.
This made the little princess sad. Even a wonderful court ball didn't cheer her up. Halfway through, she went to sit in her favorite garden, feeling sorry for herself. Above her, she could see ships moving. This made her think even more about the handsome prince.
I must do something,
She said to herself.
I know. I'll go and see the witch while my sisters are busy dancing.
When the music stops, please turn the cassette over for side 2.